gives me so much pleasure to welcome you, along with Frieze 91, Frieze's new global VIP membership program, and Frieze number 9 Cork Street, to our 6th Woman in Power speaker series. Thank you to the Frieze team for your generous hospitality and our guests for making the extra effort to navigate to this event tonight. I'm delighted to introduce to you Claire Barnett, a leader and campaigner for gender equality. She currently serves as the Chief Executive of United Nations Women UK. She advises global leaders on topics from strategy to ESG to ethics, and has worked to further women's rights for NGOs, from microfinance in Brazil to access to social protection for UK youth. I am so excited to hear you in conversation this evening with the formidable Clarissa Ward. I first met Clarissa when she participated in my Autumn-Winter 19 show at London Fashion Week, which was presented as a 2-hour marathon of 35 powerful women orators of all disciplines. I have marveled at her career ever since. Clarissa is CNN's chief international correspondent, and she has spent nearly 2 decades reporting from front lines in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Egypt, and Ukraine. She has been presented with countless honors, including 9 Emmy Awards. Clarissa has borne witness to every conflict of our time. She was on the ground in Ukraine as Russia began its invasion in February last year. She was on the ground as the Taliban took control of Afghanistan in 2021. And she has reported extensively in Syria since the start of the civil war in 2011. Her book, On All Fronts, The Education of a Journalist, detailing her singular career, is simply riveting. Thank you so much, Claire and Clarissa, for being here with us tonight. It is such a privilege for us to hear your thoughts on the topic of Women on the Front.
Thank you so much. Well, what an amazing packed room. I'm not surprised at all, but very excited to see you all. And we are, of course, having this conversation in the margins of not only International Women's Day last week, but also the UN Commission on the Status of Women, which is taking place as we speak. I've just come back from there in New York. And, you know, people often say, I sort of feel like I should have heard of UN Women, but I don't think I have. And I think that's no coincidence. So where the world is very aware of what COP is for the environment, Commission on the Status of Women is the equivalent for gender equality. And it's no surprise, I think, that the world is just waking up. So we are the smallest and youngest UN entity. We are around 12 years old. And so, you know, that puts us about half a century behind most of the other entities. And I think kind of shows the fact that this is just becoming a global priority. It's wonderful to see an International Women's Day where this year I think we're really speaking about not only celebrating the women on whose shoulders we stand, but also really talking about action. How can we all do more? The UN theme for International Women's Day this year is digital inclusion and exclusion, how the power of technology can do so much to empower and include, but can also damage and harm. And we're going to touch a little bit on some of Clarissa's experiences in that space as well. But we are an organisation that works for every woman and girl worldwide to have equal access to safety, choice and a voice at every level of society. And so it's very exciting for me to be speaking to you today, Clarissa.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So we're going to start by kind of going back to the beginning of your journey. So I'd love to know what inspired you to step into this space. After graduating from Yale, you started work as an overnight desk assistant at Fox News. And while there, you covered stories from the capture of Saddam Hussein, the Indian Ocean tsunami, to the Israeli-Lebanese war. So I'd love to know about your experiences as a woman in the newsroom. How has that changed and what inspired you to step further into that?
That's a really good question. Thank you, Edeline, first of all, for managing to hide my enormous bump in this beautiful swath of fabric. And also thank you to the Frieze, and thank you, Claire. So I grew up mostly in the UK, but also in the US. I'm a dual national. I went to a boarding school called Wickham Abbey. I then went to Westminster. I went to Yale. I had a very privileged upbringing. And it was only in my senior year of Yale. I was always very engaged with languages and travel and storytelling, but it was only my senior year 9/11 happened. And I understood that basically I had been half asleep. and not paying attention enough to what was going on in the world. And I felt a very strong, clear thunderbolt of this is my calling and this is what I'm meant to do. And what I believed in that moment that was to act as a translator, basically, between worlds, and to try to repair some of the miscommunication and misunderstanding that I felt had ultimately contributed to this horrific event. And I understood, I think, for the first time as well in that moment, that the way America sees its role in the world is not the way the rest of the world always sees America's role. And so I basically wanted to be at the tip of the spear and to try to find common humanity and use stories as a way to help us hold on to that thread of humanity that I fundamentally believe binds us all together. So those were my lofty ideas as a senior at Yale. And then, of course, I'm 22 years old, and I did an internship in Moscow for a couple of months, which was amazing, with CNN. And then CNN told me I was going to have to wait 4 months to start my job, like a full-time job in New York. And I thought that I'd be 23, I'd be so old. And then Fox News, who, I was not a big fan of Fox News, but they offered me a job on the spot for $25,000 a year. I mean, don't even ask. On the overnight desk. I would go in at midnight. I would stay until 9 in the morning. And, Fox has changed a lot for the worse. It was still pretty bad when I worked there. But it was the kind of place where, like, people made fun of me because I went to college. And so it was like, there was like a lot. It was a very kind of male, kind of frat boy vibe. And when I would tell people that I wanted to like live in the Middle East and that I would leave work at 9 a.m. and go to Brooklyn to spend an hour with this woman called Nadia, who was teaching me Arabic, who was from Yemen, they were like, okay, you're an alien from outer space and we don't even know what to do with you, but you're sort of good at your job, so I guess you can stay. But it was challenging because, it's always that weird thing when you start out, like, that you know nothing. And so you want to be humble and you want to learn. But you also know, as a woman, I think we instinctively do this thing where we really downplay our talents. And we will often say, oh, yeah, no, you should ask them to do that. That makes sense. Because, especially if you're like me and you're half British, it's like that. The British side is like, just put your head down. Don't volunteer for anything. The American side is like, God damn it. So it was a struggle to kind of find that balance between being humble and understanding that you have a lot to learn, but also being like, I have dreams and I'm really serious about them and they're going to happen. And so help me do whatever I need to do to learn what I need to learn. And I think mentoring is a huge part of what helps you get through that hideous, let's face it, few years after you graduate or when you start out in a career and you have this vision. I'm like, I want to be Christian Amanpour, and like I'm sitting on the overnight assignment desk at Fox News, like where people are making fun of me, and I'm like, okay, this is not, I'm not feeling like Christian right now. So how do I rectify this situation? So it took a while.
And in that journey, and you talk about this in your incredible book, for those of you who haven't read it yet, absolutely wonderful, and you will love it. You travel all over the world from Moscow to Afghanistan reporting, and I think one of the things that you do so amazingly is really bring out individual voices and stories of people whose power and whose influence you want to lift up. But I imagine this must have had an impact on you as well as you travelled. You cover very heavy topics. How did you find that experience?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, when you start out doing this job and you're so excited about the kind of glamour of it, or the perceived glamour of it, and I actually think we have a little bit of a tendency in our society to like fetishize war correspondence, which can be a little bit dangerous. And indeed, I think we fetishize war sometimes. And so when you start out, it's all about the excitement, the novelty, the drama, the intensity, like that is what draws you to it. I never forget going to Baghdad for the first time, 25 years old, had never been to a conflict zone. And it was the most extraordinary, thrilling experience of my life because I felt like every fiber of my being was constantly being exposed to new stimulus, was constantly learning. And my brain was just exploding with all this new input. and my heart was pounding with all of this adrenaline, which can be kind of a heady drug once you get hooked on it. And it was only a few months later, when we survived a triple suicide car bombing attack on the hotel that we were living on, the Palestine hotel, that I realized for the first time I understood that it's not a game and it's not exciting and it's the furthest thing from glamorous. But by then you're kind of already hooked and you're in it, and you know, and there is like, this is the kind of job that like a certain type of person does it. And if you are that type of person, you know deep down there's nothing else you can do. I can't be a normal person again. I mean, I could do a really good job, I think, of like pretending to be normal for, you know, a few weeks at a time. But I can't, you know, go to an office and, you know, do a 9 to 5. And I might be able to do it for a while. And maybe it will change. I mean, maybe he's got some plans for me I don't know about yet. But sort of you understand once you have already slipped into this lifestyle, it's a very, very difficult thing to let go of, because while the sort of intensity and the sadness and the darkness and often the trauma that comes with it can be really overwhelming, it is still the greatest privilege in the world, in my mind, to be able to have a front row seat on history as it's playing out, and to be able to participate in some small way in the first draft of the telling of that history. And, you know, to your point as well about being like starting out as a woman, when I was a young woman, I felt very strongly when I saw stories of war that we were very focused on a kind of very masculine way of talking about war. And it was a very, honestly, in the context that I grew up in the US, a very kind of middle-aged white male voice of God today in the West Bank, you know, and this was how these stories were told. And if you pitch stories about refugees, if you pitch stories about civilians, it was kind of like, oh, you know, that's a bit sentimental. And I always found that extraordinary, because I was like, I don't think it's sentimental. It doesn't need to be sentimental. It can be sentimental. I just think it's fascinating. I just think people are fascinating. People's stories are fascinating. Like, that's what we kind of want to engage with. The geopolitics and the jargon is also super interesting, but can be very alienating for people who maybe don't have the time to read the New York Times or the London Times or whatever paper it is, cover to cover every single day. But anyone can sit and relate to a story that we feel connected to just because of our shared sense of humanity. And so I understood pretty early on in my career that everything indeed that was devastating to me about what I was witnessing, traveling around the world and seeing oppression and seeing children die and seeing starvation and natural disasters and massacres and all sorts of horrendous things, that was also a big part of why I felt so compelled to tell these stories, and why I still continue to feel that way.
Yeah, and you know, it's interesting listening to you talk about that, because telling those stories is no easy task, right? And you know, you've touched a little bit on some of those different types of crisis that will affect us with increasing regularity, you know, climate-related disasters, conflict, and COVID, you know, pandemics of that kind. And we know that all of those crises have a disproportionate impact on women and girls and the most marginalised. And so, you know, you're travelling, you're seeing these stories. You talked a little bit about needing to be very up to the moment, and it must have been slightly different reflecting back when you wrote the book. But I'd love to ask you a little bit about, how did you weave together those narratives and make sure that they remained authentic? You didn't oversimplify, you didn't generalize, you brought those people's stories out as humans.
So, well, my mother and father had both always told me to keep a diary, and so of course I didn't. and I still don't. It's like it's such a weakness. I wish I did. It's just I'm not wired to keep a diary. But I do have lots of friends who I love very much, and I am a natural communicator, so I did write lots of emails. And particularly when I was starting out and it was all so novel and exciting and fascinating, I would write these long emails about Iraq and the people I was meeting and the stories that I was encountering. And also I had a lot of guilt in Iraq because I felt that as American journalists, we were not doing a very good job of telling the stories of the war, that we were too separated by virtue of the security situation from ordinary Iraqi people. And if you wanted to go out in Iraq during 2006, 2007, the only way to do that was with the US military. Well, that was an important part of the story too, but again, where were the Iraqi people in that? So I would write these long emails to a group of friends and my family, and they became like actually kind of the bedrock of what turned into the book. And when you are doing this work in the field, I sometimes compare it to being like a surgeon or something in the ER, right? Because you don't really have a lot of time to reflect. You're in a usually very intense and often quite dangerous situation. You have about 1,000 things on your checklist that you have to do in terms of like the nuts and bolts of like television is not like print. I can't just stand and observe. I need pictures, I need sound, I need interviews, I need some kind of internet or Wi-Fi connection that will allow me to collate those pictures and sound into a story that I then need to send. I need to do a live show. I mean, it's like an endless list. And then on top of that, I need to keep my team safe. I need to listen to what's going on around me. And I need to be present in the moment to hear people's stories. And so there's so many things going on that you kind of just go into a trance and you just do your job. You do your job, you do it to the best of your ability, and then you get everybody out safely, hopefully. And so you don't often have a lot of time to actually unpack what you've just witnessed. And you think when you're young, because you're stupid, that means you're kind of invincible. And you think you're okay, and you go home and you're like, okay, it's a little weird that I don't want to see anyone or talk to anyone, and I just want to like lie in bed and smoke cigarettes and watch Sex and the City, and like, but that's normal, right? And then you realize over time that the sort of common ideas that we have about trauma, for example, that we see in movies, right? Where like someone sees the child die, they are very sad, they go home, they have nightmares about seeing the dead child, they cry a lot, and then they go and see a therapist, and like that's not how it works in real life. Like you see the dead child, you're very busy, you make sure that you tell that story well, you try to be present and open to that moment as a human being for a moment or two, but then you get on with the job, and then you get home and you don't think about the dead child, you think about why you hate your mother so much, and then you fall down the stairs and start crying, like wailing like an animal, and then you're like, okay, something's going on here. So like all of it is to say that writing the book ultimately I think really helped me to kind of unpack a lot of it and reflect on a lot of it and really go a bit deeper into some of the experiences that I have had, and some of them which are not my experiences, but even to hold someone else in a moment where they're sharing their trauma can be like very intense, and it does sit in the body. Lynn, we were just talking about this before, but like it will often sit somewhere in the body and it stays with you. And so whenever young journalists ask me about doing this job, and sorry, I've kind of moved on from your question a bit, but whenever they ask me, I'm like, do it, greatest job in the world, but just to be clear, the check is coming at some point. Everyone's getting the check. And everyone thinks in the beginning, like, I don't think I'm getting the check. This is like all you can eat buffet of like amazingness, and there's no, there is always going to be a check.
And I'd love to dive into a couple of those situations in particular. I'm sure, many of you in the room have careers in this space or have worked in the gender equality space for some time, and I'm sure have followed very keenly some of the situations that you've spoken about. So I'd love to talk a little further about the situation in Afghanistan. From the UN Women perspective, this is probably the biggest crisis of women's rights and of human rights that we've seen in at least a generation. And we are seeing a constant rollback. You know, I know that people are feeling very desperate, and you know, it's the job of you and many others to find those voices of resilience and hope of Afghan women who have done this work on the front line for many years. How did you find reporting on that?
Afghanistan is so heartbreaking for a number of reasons. First of all, I don't think it's possible to be an American or a Brit or, you know, a citizen of any country that participated in that war and not feel a profound sense of guilt. Not guilt about the policy decisions or what, you know, I don't think it's necessarily about that. But what I feel guilty about is that there is a whole generation of women in Afghanistan who were told and encouraged to dream. Dream big. Send your girls to school. Be a politician. Be a judge. Start your own business. And now they have been told, no. There's no dreaming anymore. There's no place for dreaming for girls in Afghanistan. And that, to me, is heartbreaking because I spend a lot of time as well in areas that have been under Taliban control for a long time. And I've talked to the girls there because there's very intensely enforced gender segregation. I usually stay with the girls there. And they were never told they could dream. So they have always kind of lived this experience very much home-based. Some of them never actually leave their homes. They work from dawn till dusk. They are cleaning, they are cooking, they are mending, they are, I mean, anything you can imagine. Like their day is full. And you would ask something of these women or girls like, what would be your dream? And it's an alien concept to them, right? I mean, this is something that is really sort of a Western construct, actually. So they are in less pain because they haven't gone through that, yes, you can dream, yes, you should dream, no, just kidding, there's no dreaming for you. So seeing women in that situation where they are forced to explain to their daughters that now they can't go to school, that now they're not going to be judges, they're not going to probably work in any capacity. The Taliban had given their word about so many things, and they have consistently backpedaled or just outright lied. I had a conversation with a Taliban leader who said that he understood very well the important role that women were playing working with humanitarian organizations, because especially in a lot of these international organizations, it's women, Afghan women, who are supporting huge families, who are the pillars of these organizations. And as some of you probably know, it was, I guess it's been a few months now, they said no more, women can't work on international organizations anymore. Women can't work in aid organizations. And so you see, you know, what started out as the Taliban promising that they'd changed and that things would be different, and then this just gradual unwinding of all the progress that has been made. And there's no cause for optimism on any level, honestly. I speak to the Taliban. I understand the Taliban is not a monolith. There are a number of disagreements within the top leadership of the Taliban about issues like women's education. But because the Taliban is so wary of becoming factionalized or splintered off, their outlook on this is until we can achieve consensus from within on some of these issues, our blanket sort of reaction will just be to reject these things until we can build the consensus. So it is a very bleak picture, and I don't know how this movie ends. I desperately hope it does not end with a return to the misery that women lived through in the late 1990s in Afghanistan. The one thing I will say, and I do think this is important, because sometimes we have a tendency in the sort of language we use or the outlook that we have to infantilize or victimize Afghan women a bit, right? And we talk about them like they're just poor, helpless little, women. And they're not. They are incredibly brave. They are incredibly strong. They are still dreaming. I interviewed a young girl they've set up these schools. Some people call them secret schools. They're actually not really secret schools because the Taliban knows about them. The girls can't get diplomas in these schools, right? They're called like trade schools. Like they're supposed to be learning how to sew or something. And then, in the back room, they're all doing algebra and learning languages and history. And it was incredible talking to some of the girls in the school because they understand that they won't get a diploma. So they can't get a job per se or a qualification out of it. But they don't care. They want to learn for the sake of learning. They understand that knowledge is power. And then they're already plotting ways. Okay, do I need to get to Pakistan? Can I get a scholarship somewhere internationally? Whatever it is, they are constantly trying to conceive of ways to improve their situation. And by the way, some of them are continuing to protest, which is insane given the level of danger. And I have been to one of these women's protests, and they were firing rounds off from a machine gun over our heads. It is not safe. I have interviewed women who have been arrested simply for attending these protests and held for days on end and abused. So they are not victims. They are incredibly strong. They are very inspiring. And I would just say for everyone in this room, the only thing they need from you is to continue to engage and to continue to pay attention and to continue to care. It's overwhelming. No one's asking anyone to come up with the solution, but just being there and caring and being engaged makes a huge difference. Their biggest fear is that they will be forgotten by the world. And so, that's a huge responsibility for me as a journalist and getting trickier all the time because the Taliban just keeps banning more and more journalists from working there. But I think it's a rallying cry for all of us.
Yeah, and I'm so glad that you bring that up because so our biggest global office was in Afghanistan before this recent takeover. And it's a situation where, as you say, we're looking at over a decade of desperately fighting for those rights and having those roll back. And our global executive director, Seema Bahu's just returned from a meeting with the Taliban on mission and saying, we will not accept the aid flows that your country desperately needs to flow into the country and only flow into the hands of men. And international NGOs, please don't replace your workers with men. But, that sometimes comes under controversy. People say, why are you even engaging with the Taliban? It's not a legitimate government. And I think these women are absolutely saying the worst thing that you can do is leave us behind and leave us with no media outlets covering our voices, nobody lifting up our stories and the designs that we know will work for the country. It's putting them at the forefront, not allowing them to become a vulnerable group as opposed to leaders. And so I think it's super important that you're sharing that narrative with everyone here and continuing to tell those stories. I'd like to move to Ukraine. You've just recently returned from there and we talk a lot in this space about how those disasters do have disproportionate impacts on women, particularly sadly with the rise of exploitation and gender-based violence in the aftermath of a disaster such as that. Now, we're speaking to women who are 20% of the country's occupied, 80% isn't, but certainly that impact runs throughout the country and very real terms into people's lives. What did you witness there?
I mean, first of all, I would say that, Ukrainian women are, as are Afghan women, but in a very different way, next level resilient, tough as nails, just incredibly brave. And what was so interesting with Ukraine is that most of us who were there in the run-up to the war didn't believe the invasion was going to happen. And the Americans were saying every day it was going to happen. And the Ukrainian government was not saying that for a number of reasons. And some of which have ended up being a bit controversial, but that's sort of neither here nor there. The point is that most Ukrainians didn't believe their country was about to be invaded. And so you would think there would be like complete disarray when it happened. Now, of course, it was like a horrifying shock to the system, and there was a lot of very intense emotion and fear and all the rest of it. But the speed with which Ukraine suddenly was just on a war footing, and with which people were packing their children and maybe their parents into cars and sending them to safer parts of the country while they were volunteering, joining the territorial defense, setting up humanitarian organizations. It took international aid organizations quite a while to kind of ensconce themselves in Ukraine. But the reality is the Ukrainians were doing like an amazing job very, very quickly of raising funds, distributing aid, working out where it needed to go. They're incredibly resourceful, incredibly tech savvy. And again, just challenging that narrative of like, they're not victims. They have borne the brunt of so many horrors, but they are responding in a way that I think would leave most of us feeling humbled. Now, the reality is for women, it is incredibly challenging because almost every man of military age in Ukraine is deployed now, either on the front lines or in some other capacity. So women are raising families on their own. Often they are also working. As I said before, some of them have joined the military. I work with some incredible Ukrainian female journalists who literally work tirelessly 24/7. I get to come back to London in between trips and relax. Their whole life is this, and they have sent their children to live with their parents because they're so committed to telling these stories. I think where you see the highest levels of vulnerability, or the thing that has like really burned my heart and just moved me profoundly, is to see the number of older women who are, the air raid siren?
That probably feels more familiar to you than most people in the room. So
there's so many elderly women who are living in towns and villages along the front lines that have been completely destroyed. And Ukrainians are very stubborn people about leaving their homes. I mean, there will be like nonstop shelling and bombing, and they'll be like, I built this house, why should I leave? And I'm like, well, because you might die. So they're very, very strong. Sometimes too strong for their own good, I would argue, because it's been difficult and challenging in some of these areas to evacuate people in a kind of efficient manner. But I have seen countless women. We were in a place called Avdiivka, really on the front lines in the Donbass region in the east, and we were going around with a volunteer who basically, in between shelling, would just run up into people's apartments, give them blankets, give them food, whatever, and then leave again for a week and then come back. So we visited this woman called Lydia, who was in her 80s, who wouldn't let go of me when we went in, because I speak some Russian as well. She just kept holding me and kissing me and hugging me, and because she had been starved, aside from the fact that her windows were blown out from shelling, that she had no food, that she had no running water, and that she was basically going to die there. She was so lonely. She was so lonely, and so it was, and the volunteer, who was like this hulking great middle-aged guy, is weeping like a baby. I'm crying because I'm like, how are we going to leave this woman? I mean, I just don't even understand. And we did leave her, and then the piece went on air, and my mother called me and was like, all right, if you don't get Lydia out of there by tomorrow, like, you're not my child anymore. So Lydia now lives in a really nice nursing home in Dnipro. But that's not the point, okay? Because Lydia's one person. And during the course of my travels in Ukraine, I can't tell you how many Lydias I've met. And their husbands are often dead because they're older and women live longer than men there. And their sons are on the front lines. And another woman who I visited with who would move her bed around because she had all these holes in the roof and it was raining, and she's in all on her own and it's freezing cold and there's no power and there's no water. And that to me is just agony to see anyone in that situation, but particularly to see elderly women so often in that situation and so reluctant still to leave because they don't really have anywhere to go to. And so what do? You move them, and I've been to some of these dormitories that they set up, and so they'll move them into a dormitory. Okay, so I'm in the dormitory for a week and I'm in a room with, 40 beds in it, and there's not a lot of dignity in that. And, Ukrainian women have a lot of dignity. And so there's not a really easy answer or solution, except that obviously in these areas you want to try to start rebuilding as soon as possible and return basic services so that they can have a better life. But that is really challenging as well when you're in a war zone that is an active war zone, because arguably it's foolish to start to rebuild a town that's so close to the front line. So yeah.
I think you pick up on a couple of really important things there. One being, sometimes around International Women's Day, we talk about women as if we all walk through the world in the same way, right? And actually, in a lot of these situations, in Ukraine in particular, older women, people of colour, disabled women, trans women, are having multiple intersecting forms of unequal experience in this. And I also think, you mentioned there, some of those needs that we forget about in crises, right? So our office there really often will say, actually, it's been 3 weeks and these displaced women have had no period products, no baby formula, no nappies, no dignity curtains, so that girls on their period have somewhere to change in the camp. And these things, women's services are always the first to be cut in a crisis. And if we don't really peel back the layers and say, actually, what are the unique needs that women and girls have, we will forget about those. And so I think it's so important that you bring those up. I'd like to ask a couple of questions about the book itself. And we will have time for Q&A, so please do start thinking, getting your questions ready. I'm sure you have many. But something that really struck me reading it, as I mentioned before, is the way that you bring very complex, multilateral political issues to life through human stories. And I think a lot of writing, dare I say, traditionally male writing in this area doesn't do that. I'm going to read a quote from the book. You say, "In a sense, I had failed in my quest to act as a translator between worlds. There were too many who didn't want to hear the stories of others, who felt that listening was tantamount to weakness, who believed that humanising the other was dangerous." So you obviously feel that humanising everybody in these situations is important and bringing humanity back to everyone in the story, whatever side they're on. In the writing process, you're going back over these emails, you're thinking back on your experiences in the newsroom. How did you go about bringing humanity to those stories?
I think the stories that have stayed with me, and there's so many of them, but the stories that have stayed with me invariably are the stories that have moved me. And that there's a difference between knowing something intellectually and feeling something in your gut. And I mean, to give you one example, in Syria, I had so many different experiences, but there was one young, lovely Syrian who I stayed with. He was working as an activist with a sort of rebel group in northern Syria. He had studied English at the University of Damascus and was passionate about English poetry. And we would get back from shooting for like 14-hour days, and he would want to like recite Keats to me and stuff, which was, adorable. But I was also like, okay, I really gotta get some work done here. But he was very sincere and quite naive, and just a lovely young man. And his town was getting bombed a lot. And I stayed in touch with him. His name was Mohammed. I stayed in touch with him after we left, and we would Skype, this is back when Skype was a thing. And every few months we would Skype. And then he got married, which was very exciting. So I Skyped with him and his wife. And then he had a baby. So I Skyped with him and his wife and his baby. And then I would also get these messages about how desperate the situation was. When I was there, they really didn't have enough food. And so if anyone has ever been to Syria, or indeed many places in the Middle East, but like they put on these like huge crazy spread for you as a guest always. And I noticed, I looked at the spread and I could see there were a lot of things like radishes and za'atar and some bread and stuff, but there wasn't a lot of like protein. There was like some tinned luncheon meat. And so I said to my crew, like, I was like, please don't eat. You got to make a big deal about your eating. Wow, this is like, whoa, you know, delicious. But don't eat too much because it's clear that they don't have a lot of food. And because they're giving us everything they have. And that's the Syrian mentality. Like, you will eat until you are stuffed and I will go to bed hungry. And that's fine because you're my guest. So he had no money, and the situation got worse, and then the next door house got bombed, and then his cousin got bombed, and it just got worse and worse, and it became clearer and clearer that the West was not really going to intervene in any meaningful way. And then one day I like never heard from Mohammed again. He just stopped messaging me, stopped Skyping me, anything. And I was really perturbed about it, and I would think about it every once in a while, and it just would bother me. I didn't think he was dead, although in Syria a lot of people I had spent time with and become friends with had died, so I couldn't discount that. And then one day, like a year later, I wrote to him and I was like, Mohammed, where are you? And he was like, I'm in Raqqa now. And Raqqa at that time was the self-declared capital of ISIS. So I was like, what are you doing in Raqqa? Like, you don't belong in Raqqa. And he just wrote to me, you don't know Mohammed so good anymore. And like, you know, that's the kind of thing that I can't put that on the evening news because I don't have the pictures and the, you know, it's not that kind of a story. But that's why I wrote a book. Because all of these moments behind the camera where you really understand the journey that takes people to places. It's very hard when you just see the end result. You're like, well, you're a terrorist. You know, those guys are psychos. Sorry, you got to go. But when you know the journey and you know the person, it's so much more intense and painful and challenging. And sometimes in media, that's difficult for us, right? We tend to try to put narratives in a way that are accessible to people. But the beauty of writing a book is that I don't have to make it easy for you. I can tell you that we live in a world where there are many shades of gray, and that embracing the gray and understanding the gray, and you could still have your principles and your convictions and your beliefs while acknowledging that the world is not black and white, and that a lot of the traditional binaries that we have imposed on the world are way more complex than we give them credit for. And so something like that, like, you know, it just is, it's seared in your mind. You just never forget that. I never forget Mohammed. Even now, I'm like, is he still alive? Where is he? You know, I mean, I don't think I have Skype anymore, so I don't really have any way to find out, but.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that with us. I think that story kind of really brings to life some of the complexity of these issues. And you mentioned hunger as well, and of course that's an unequal issue. You know, where there is food scarcity, sadly women and girls will be the last to eat, the ones who are responsible for gathering food and water, and also will typically receive lower quality nutritional food, right? So, you know, again, there's a complexity of inequality in a number of these issues.
Definitely.
But look, I think, you know, as those of you who've had the chance to read the book already will have been lucky enough to see, there is a real element of adventure in this book, right? There's a sense of thrill that I'm sure.
There's like bad love affairs in there too. I mean, there's plenty of fun. There's plenty of fun too.
You can imagine kind of young girls aspiring to be journalists reading this and going, oh, this is the life I want to lead, right? But you know, you're also very careful to kind of not make it just an adventure story. And of course, there are very many sobering stories, but you also, I'd love to touch on the title because there's a really critical thread. Perhaps you were thinking of younger readers being exposed to this, but about education in so many of the stories. The subtitle is The Education of a Journalist, and that really interested me. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, my mother's friend had the idea for On All Fronts, because the Brits love a good pun. And they were like, oh, it's brilliant, front lines, but also, you know, we delve into your love life, your family life, and all of that too. And then my publisher was like, yes, the education of a journalist. And in the beginning I was like, is that what this book is about? Often when you write a book, you don't realize what it's about until the end. And then, you know, I know when I started writing it, she was like, I think women is going to be a big theme for you. And I was like, yeah, you think? I don't know. I mean, I love women, but I don't think about them that much per se. And then you start writing it and you're like, oh, wow, no. Turns out being a woman has had a big impact on me. And it's only sort of through writing the book that you realize that. But I think what I understood is that, like, so many of, you know, all the experiences that I've had, good and bad and funny and sad and all the rest of it, had sort of taken me to this moment now where you feel like you're still learning, you're still always curious, you're still humble, but you're kind of confident in your métier. Whereas when I look at where I started out, I see, you know, the gaps and the things that I've learned along the way. And so, yeah, I think in some ways this is, and I hadn't intended it to be that way, it is a book for young journalists, or not specifically, but can be, to kind of feel their way into, like, how you learn about covering conflict. Because actually there aren't very many guides written on this. And I hope the idea with my book is to guide them not just as a journalist, but as a human being. Because a lot of what is written out there is written more as a, like, you know, the swashbuckling adventurer, and then, son, the next thing you do is get yourself a job at a good paper. Yeah. And I wanted to write as well about, you know, trying to balance keeping your humanity throughout that process. And to be honest, that education is still ongoing.
Yeah. Well, no, and I love the humility that, you know, with that idea of the next generation might be reading this, the humility that you put throughout that, right? Because I think, you know, you talk a lot about idealism, about how we need to see the world. And I'd like to talk a little bit, before we go to Q&A, about, you know, you've seen incredibly difficult things, and you've talked about the world being in shades of grey and how difficult that can be for, you know, all of us to listen to and for you to witness, and certainly for the reality of those at the forefront of it. But I think having this conversation around International Women's Day, we also need an element of hope, right? You know, we are celebrating women who've been doing this work for many, many years, and including those in Afghanistan where, sure, UN Women's latest data says we're 300 years from gender equality and that COVID has rolled us back, right? And we cannot accept that reality, and we will not. And we're at possibly the most important moment the women's movement has ever seen. So out of all of these things that you see, you know, what gives you hope and really keeps you inspired?
I mean, honestly, women are incredible. Women are fierce. Women are resilient. Women have depths of strength that they don't even know they have, you know? I mean, I feel like I'm someone who, you know, I'll do my tax return and have a nervous breakdown, right? And then you think, how could I actually deal with real adversity? But then you go into situations where people are dealing with adversity, and you realize that, like, women often are dealing the best with it in some ways. So I give you an example, and it tends to be a very different way of coping. But when I was in Syria and I was in Aleppo and there was relentless bombardment, I mean, it was absolutely petrifying. Just like nonstop shells just falling all around the house and through the night, because they understand that people start to go crazy if they can't sleep. And the men and women were in different rooms, and the men were all sitting in this one room, chain smoking and arguing about politics. And none of them were letting on that they were scared. They just were shouting at each other louder and louder as the bombs got closer and closer. Then I went in to sit with the women, because it's a sort of weird privilege of my kind of role that I can sit in both rooms usually. And the women were like, this is petrifying. And some of them were crying, and others were comforting, and some were reading the Quran. And to me, it felt like a much more honest and real processing of the intensity of the moment. No one was pretending to be brave, but some were stepping in to be carers. Others were allowing themselves to fall apart, which needs to happen sometimes. And this went on throughout the night, and then it ended up in a crazy situation where they got me singing them hymns because they were reciting the Quran. They're like, "What do you guys do?" And I was like, I was like, "Well, we sing hymns, I guess." And they were like, "Sing us a hymn." And I was like, So I sang Jerusalem to them. And then my male producer from next door was like, the Assad's army can hear you. So, I mean, maybe take it down a notch. And then they got up, these women, at 6 a.m. and, made breakfast for their children and brushed and braided their hair and put on a brave face for them and came up with some elaborate story about what all the bangs had been the night before. And I just thought, you are going to carry this society through this. You're going to carry your families and your communities through this because your strength and your generosity are mind-blowing, and your willingness to accept the horror and not try to pretend that it's not happening and not shout and get angry, although there's a time for that as well, but just kind of be in the moment. So I realize that doesn't sound like an uplifting story, but it is, because you realize women are extraordinary, and the more they are empowered and the more they are given, the more they will contribute to their families, to their communities, to their countries, and you are going to see, I have no doubt, a difference, particularly, when I look at conflict, and let's face it, this is primarily a male issue. I'm not saying that if women were running the world, there'd be no war. That's, I think, is simplistic. But I do think war would look different. And I do think that the more women feel the courage to stand up and stand into their own and meet the moment, the more we're going to see profound and exciting changes happening in terms of our understanding of what shared humanity means and how we deal with conflict and trauma.
Yeah, thank you. That's so important, isn't it? And I certainly look at the girls who are leading a revolution on the streets of Iran with incredible bravery and think, if we can't take hope from that generation, what can we take hope from? So I think that point on resilience is so important to close us from the main section of this. But we would love to do some Q&A. So we have time for about 3 questions. Please do put your hands up. Afua, if it is you, please go ahead.
Thank you for this. I really enjoyed listening to you. And Clarissa, I'm so grateful for your work. As somebody who, I've been a journalist for about 20 years, found myself as a war correspondent for 3 years and hated it, I have so much awe and admiration for what you do, because it really is very difficult. And I think it is a calling, actually. And as you said, it takes a certain kind of person who both has the resilience to keep seeing those stories, but the humanity to actually be able to relay them in a way that does justice to the experience. I also teach journalism at USC, and one of the things I find fascinating is how many of my students, and I teach international reporting, how many of my students have come into journalism specifically because they feel they have a story that they haven't seen reflected in the media.
Yeah.
And they want to report in a way that does justice to their own experience, and they want to insert their perspective in their storytelling, but they're also navigating the requirements of impartiality and objectivity. I feel very strongly that our idea of objectivity for a long time was basically the default perspective of the white middle-class, middle-aged man. But I also think it is important as reporters that we still earn the trust of our audience by being balanced. And I'm just really curious, you've talked about being a woman and how that brings a different perspective to your reporting, and I think we've all seen that. But how do you navigate that? How do you wrestle with the question of how much to take up space as a woman who has a certain perspective, but also maintaining that line of impartiality and balance?
It's a really good question. I'm a big fan of yours as well, thank you. So what I would say is, first and foremost, I think that we need to build better trust with our audiences, our readerships, our viewerships. And one important part of that is being honest. The myth of impartiality is exactly that. It's a myth that was based on one worldview, one perspective, and we were selling it as the voice of God. And I think it is wonderful that we are starting more and more, and there is a lot more work to be done, to understand that we are all a product of our upbringing, education, ethnicity, religion, whatever it might be. This is all part of who we are as individual storytellers, and we have inherent biases as a result of that just exist. Rather than pretending that those don't exist or pretending to be something we're not, I think it is good to just be kind of transparent about, this is my perspective as a woman, this is my perspective as whatever it might be, or as a Westerner, as a Ivy League graduate, however it pertains to the situation. I think that there is a way to be transparent about the ways in which your experience affects your storytelling without going and crossing the Rubicon and making yourself the center of the story. Mm-hmm. Because I agree with you. I think it becomes problematic when I become the center of the story. And this is a very real tension that I think we feel in television quite a lot, and we see a lot more of this kind of storytelling. My instinct is, in the moment when things are happening, be authentic, let it play out. If you are moved to tears, you don't need to make a show of it, but if it happens, let it play out. And then you can decide later when you go to edit the material, which is a whole other level of kind of, retelling stories, but whether you want to use that shot or whether you feel that's making it too much about you as a woman and detracting from the story that you're supposed to be telling. I think the ultimate sort of, for me, the guiding principle is, yes, my perspective is embedded in the storytelling, and it may make the tent a bit bigger in terms of bringing others in who identify with me in some way and identify with my way of telling stories, and and have them engage with these stories. So that is really hugely important. But ultimately, my job is to tell this person's story. It's not about me. It's not about my perspective. It's not about my understanding of any given situation. It's not about my outrage on behalf of it's about this person sitting before me, sharing my story. And so I try really hard mentally just to keep the focus on the subject and their story, and at the same time be transparent, or as transparent as I can, with the viewer about the process of like how the sausage is made, because as we know, there's a lot of steps along the way where all sorts of things get baked into a story. So be transparent and try to be honest about. But Christian Amanpour said something a few years ago that really stuck with me, which is truthful, not neutral, and that has been really helpful for me in terms of trying to find that line. Because listen, we all have different versions of reality on certain level, and that's okay. That makes for much more vibrant, vivid, diverse, exciting, compelling storytelling, right? With a much wider viewership and everything. But at the same time, like, this is a microphone, okay? It's not a pencil. So we have to kind of also have a framework where we can agree that, like, yes, we have like different perspectives, and that's a beautiful thing, but also facts are facts, and like, this dress is blue.
Thank you so much. If we can get the mic just here to Lara, that would be great.
I'll try and ask this eloquently because everyone's speaking so incredibly, and thank you for the talk. What you spoke about with narratives and kind of, the humanizing stories, we'll start with, the humanizing stories being sentimental and then being disregarded, maybe perhaps earlier on in your career, and then also the narratives of terrorism being so complex. It kind of made me think of the narratives that we are often fed in the media of refugees arriving in boats and the complexities of their stories and how humanising stories maybe don't get told. The question I kind of want to ask you is, do you think the reason those stories aren't told is less about the sentimentality but more about the danger they might impose on the status quo? And in your career, if you've ever experienced that?
You know, I think there's two sort of levels. First of all, I think there's a lot of lazy journalism out there, and there's a lot of journalism that's not motivated by telling people stories, but by serving other people's political agendas. And I can understand the allure of that, because you'll see, you know, you put one tweet with a hot take that fits into someone's narrative about an idea, let's say about refugees, and suddenly everybody's cheering you on and retweeting you and saying you're great, and that's pretty heady stuff. It's also not journalism. Journalism is about telling people's stories, I believe, fundamentally, about holding people in power accountable, about asking questions, and often about forcing us out of our comfort zones. I have talked to countless refugees from dozens of countries all over the world. And let me tell you, I have never met anyone who said, I just really want to be a refugee. I just really want to get free healthcare. I just really want to come and take your taxpayer money and use it for my own purposes because I don't want to work. Every refugee I have ever met has been in a situation where it is a choice of life and death, and where the only step forward is into the unknown, often onto a boat. Often they can't swim. They have children with them who also can't swim. This is not a decision you make to exploit someone else's benevolence or political system. So it does frustrate me sometimes when I see the way some media will cover certain stories. And I would love to not be such a cynical person that I would assume that sometimes that is because they understand that the larger appetite domestically might be for a certain type of story. So I think it's important for all of us to keep our storytelling grounded in reality and humanity, and that doesn't mean that stories aren't complicated. That doesn't mean that the issue of refugees suddenly becomes like, oh yes, just open the doors and everything will be fine. Like, we all understand, like, this is challenging content. This is hard work. And so any narrative, frankly, that simplifies to the point of becoming grotesquely reductive is ultimately unhelpful and not doing a service to ordinary people who basically just want to understand and educate themselves, so that when it comes time to make or influence decisions or policymakers, that they're in a better position to do that.
Thank you. And we have time for one more question. So yes, please go ahead. We'll take the mic to you.
First of all, I'd like to say that despite the subject matter, I found this conversation extremely positive in very many ways.
Oh, good.
And this is a question to both of you about Afghanistan and the situation. Obviously, with the Saudi Arabia on one side and the Iranians on the other side in their joint history, do you see any real glimmer of hope in terms of women's rights coming from either side? I mean, obviously we're following what's going on in Iran, Saudi Arabia trying to improve their image with a massive tourism campaign and, you know, art installations in the desert and all sorts of other things. But do you see any real change coming on either side that might impact the Afghani situation?
You go first.
Yeah, so I suppose the question there is really about, actually perhaps this has been a very uplifting conversation in some ways, and finding hope in some of those complex situations. And yeah, I will go first to give you the last word before we wrap up on that. I think from my perspective, we have gone through a door with the global women's movement that we will not go back through and allow to be closed on us. I remember at some point very early in my journey with UN Women, I stepped off a plane back to the UK after a number of years abroad, and there were magazines on the front of racks that had, remember the fashion show? I'm trying to remember which year it was, but there were t-shirts saying we should all be feminists, and I was like, do we use that as a mainstream word now? And look, I think there's huge nuance within the global women's movement. Of course, it is vastly unequal in some parts of the world versus others. But I think the fact that we have digital tools, going back to the theme of International Women's Day, that yes, can be used for harm. And if you read the book, you'll very much hear about how some of that has affected Clarissa, but also can be used for huge mobilisation. And I think on a global level, we will refuse to take steps backwards as a global movement. This is now out in the open. I do think we're standing at the threshold of a new era. And I think if we can keep up that solidarity with women around the world and remember that, yes, we have huge issues on our doorstep, but also there are critical issues transforming the lives of women and girls around the world. I think the thing I would say is we have to be vigilant about the splintering of that movement. We have so many things that make us different, but we also have a huge amount of common ground. And if we allow disagreements within the women's movement to make us feel like we're turning against each other rather than towards each other, I do think it will slow. So we have to recognise that gender equality is good for everyone. It's good for businesses, communities and societies. And so we need to work on that for the good of everybody globally. And I don't think we will go back. I'd love to hear your take.
Yeah, I think I definitely agree. You're not putting the genie back in the bottle, right? And I think many countries, including Saudi Arabia, understand that they need to either participate in some kind of a semblance of working towards a solution, or they're going to lose out big time, financially. I mean, on every single level. It's been proven now that having women who are actively participating in your society on multiple levels has a really, truly positive impact on that society. I do think at the same time that we also need to be a little cautious about imposing our values of this is what women's rights looks like, this is what gender equality looks like, because in different cultures and different societies that means different things to different people. And I also think you need to respect that things take time and you can't wave a magic wand and make everything different in a period of 5 years, and that whole society has just made that leap right alongside. And I think Afghanistan's kind of a perfect metaphor in that sense, because look, 20 years, profound societal change, profound change for women. Turns out the Taliban, who were there the whole time, haven't really changed at all, and nor have the women living in their orbit. So that doesn't mean you kind of pander or you create a false equivalent, but you have to be respectful of the fact that these processes need to come from within, often on an organic and authentic level. And they are going to play out in the way that they need to play out in order to be meaningful changes, as opposed to the West sitting there and being like, you really should let your women do X, Y, and Z because, look at us. That, in my experience, doesn't work as well. So I see a lot of improvements and a lot of small granules of hope, and it's frustrating because it doesn't happen on the timescale that I think a lot of us would like to see. And it doesn't mean you take your foot off the gas for a second. It doesn't mean you stop telling these stories and stop shining a light on some of these very important issues. But ultimately, I do see that even in some places that have traditionally not been progressive in terms of women's rights or gender equality at all, there is a growing recognition that the only way to move is forward. Unfortunately, I would say Afghanistan is the one kind of stubborn outlier. Let's see what happens, and let's just not give up hope on the Afghan women.
Yeah, can I grab that? Thank you. Thank you so much. I think that's such an important note to end on. And also, it's quite tactical. It's quite, the only way we're going to crack this is really thinking what matters to each of these leaders and how do we use that to benefit the women's movement. It has to go beyond an ethical imperative to actually, it's good for business, it's good for societies, we've just got to get in there. And I know that, would have loved to hear from all of you in the audience in this room as well, because you represent all sorts of walks of life and incredible activism in this space. So I'm sure these conversations will continue over book signing, which we're very excited about. And, I think we're also having this conversation at quite a special moment because, I think there's an element of motherhood here and passing these values on to the next generation. So
Three boys as well. So
3 boys.
I got a lot of work to do.
So, if there's something that gives me hope, it's having mothers passing those messages on to their sons. So I hope that we are leaving with that sentiment of hope tonight, which I think is incredible. And all that's left for me to say is thank you so much to our hosts, to Frieze, to Edeline, and thank you so much, Clarissa. This has been hugely uplifting and enlightening for me, and I'm sure all of you as well, and just fascinating to hear your insights. So
thank you so much, Clara. Thank you. I really enjoyed it. Thank you. It was great.
Well, thank you both for such an amazing evening. Thank you to wonderful Edeline who put together these talks. Thank you all for coming. I would strongly encourage you all to pick up one of Clarissa's books, but leave one for me because I want one too. Take your time, see the galleries. I hope you've had a chance to look at some of the art already. If you have any questions at all about our membership program, we're here for a good amount of time. But thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.